Today is November 2nd, 2009. My name is Annie Lay, and I am present at the home of Bethine Church in Boise. I'm here for the purpose of conducting an oral history with Bethine on behalf of the Sawtooth Interpretive and Historical Association based in Stanley, and we are collecting oral histories from people with a particularly close associations with the Sawtooth and Salmon River country. Bethine, tell me when and where you were born.
Well, I always was a little embarrassed. I was born in Salt Lake City because we didn't have a hospital that was equipped well near Mackay. So my father and mother had lost a baby boy 14 years before I was born, and so they weren't taking any chances. So we went to Salt Lake. But I spent my first Christmas at the ranch up in the Stanley Basin at the ranch on the Salmon River, which was called Robinson Bar Ranch.
All right. And when were you born?
In 1923 on the 2nd of February.
Tell me a little bit about your parents, if you would, please.
Well, Pop was a lawyer and governor, and he was in the legislature from Custer County and from Bonneville County. So he had a long career, and after he was governor, he became a federal judge.
And his name was Chase Clark?
Chase Clark, yes. His brother was governor before he was. That was Priscilla Clark.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, and they both ran against the same man, which was, Pop ran against him because he was mad because he'd beaten Uncle Brazil. And his name was Batolfson, and he was from Arco. So it was all very closely within the family there.
Uh-huh.
And when Pop was working for the governor in Boise, he was the adjutant to the governor, and he went with the National Guard down to Mexico, and I don't know why they thought we were at war with someone from Mexico when the war was going on over in Europe. But on his way home, after they disbanded, on his way home, he had a car accident and hurt his arm. And my mother said, I think we should have you near the hot spring. And there's a wonderful one, the stagecoach up at Robinson Bar. And that was an old gold bar. And that was why they called it a Robinson Bar, because it was where they took gold out of a bar right down at the end of the property.
So this would have been around the end of World War I?
No, actually, it was before. It was about 1914.
Okay.
And they homesteaded the ranch so that they could have it.
Your parents did?
Uh-huh. They didn't have the money to buy it. They just wanted to homestead it. And that was at the time of the Homestead Act.
Uh-huh.
So they took advantage of it and moved right up there. And Pop, with the natural hot water spring, got his arm back. And then the whole family came and stayed and made the two pools that are there. There are two natural hot water pools.
Oh.
And this was fun because there was a man who came through the country trying to dry out, and my mother was always having somebody come and offering them a place to stay. And when he stayed there, he was an engineer, and he engineered the two pools. They're still there.
Oh, wonderful.
One was an inside pool, one was an outside pool. The building on the inside pool has been many years gone. But when I was young, it was there.
Uh-huh.
And we loved it. The ranch just meant so much to everybody.
Now, when you say you moved directly there, did you move there from Mackay? Your family moved there from Mackay, or
No, they did. They moved from Mackay.
your
there.
mom and dad?
Yeah, I wasn't born yet.
Okay, but they had previously been living in Mackay.
Yeah, and of course, Papa was, when he was over here with the governor, he was in Boise, and Mom came with him.
Uh-huh.
Mom always went wherever he went.
Uh-huh.
So,
Was she interested in politics also?
no, but she was interested in Pop. So they went down, she went down to the Mexican border, which made the man who was in command very, very mad, because she told all the wives they should come on down. There was a good hotel there where they were all encamped, and she thought that it wasn't be any fun to be away from my father that long.
Ah.
And so when they came back and he was trying to get well, they homesteaded the ranch, and then with this man who had come for the summer, he was an engineer, and he engineered the pools. And so they had a wonderful time. And after I was born, I spent my first winter when I was just in a snowsuit on a big fluffy animal skin in the front yard. The snow was high. I've got pictures of it. It was perfectly wonderful.
Oh.
And from that time on, every summer we went there.
Uh-huh.
And Pop would drive up from Mackay, where he was a lawyer. And at that time, Mackay was a boom town. It was they had a copper mill. There were fights between the sheepmen and the cattlemen, and he was always involved with litigation. But he'd come up the river, up over what we called 5 Points. It was the road was on the other side of the river. It was on the ranch side, and it was just mountainous on the other side of the river, of the salmon.
So you kind of came up sort of what would now be considered the back way from Mackay to get to the ranch?
Yeah, well, actually, we came up, we didn't go to Chalice, but we came up through what was then sort of a little draw, and over to the Salmon River, and then came up the Salmon on the left-hand side of it, up to the ranch, because there was a road there.
Uh-huh. Just a gravel road, probably?
Oh, yeah, and a very twisty. They called it 5 Points because it was like threading a needle to get up it. And my father taught everybody that if they met a car, they had to be the ones to back up, because whoever they were meeting probably wouldn't. And so you'd have to back up to a turnout, because it was not a two-way road, but they had many turnouts. And you'd back up. And then he also said, and my Aunt Beulah actually had it happen to her, he said, now if you ever meet anything coming too fast, you're going to hit it square on, so you don't go into the river.
Oh.
And she did it with a brand new car, and she said, Pop, I hit this truck straight on. And he said, was anyone hurt? She said, no. He said, well, that's fine, you did good.
Yeah, I wouldn't have thought about that. Most people would try to swerve probably out of the way.
Yeah, and if you do that, you probably get knocked right into the river.
Oh.
And it was way, way down. And I'd always know when Pop was coming in the summer, because you could hear in those mountains so well, and those old cars had so much noise. When they'd shift into gear to go up around 5 Points, you could hear it go rrrr, and they'd come up, and I'd always be out by the front rock and the front gate to meet him.
So did he stay in Mackay and work and
Yeah.
come back and
We
forth?
came
to the
out,
ranch?
he came up every weekend.
Oh.
And my mother ran the ranch, and she could cut up a steer because her father had been in a butcher shop in Mackay. And so there wasn't anything my mother couldn't do.
Well, how big was the ranch? How many acres?
123.
Uh-huh.
And when Frank wanted to make the SNRA, first they talked about making it a park, but it just got too complicated, and they thought for the small acreage, having all those facilities to take care of park people wouldn't be a good idea. So they wanted to make it a Sawtooth recreation area. And while he was fighting that, our ranch was on the far side of it. The Boulder White Clouds were right behind us, and Stanley was 19 miles from us, and there were the Sawtooths. So we were right in between, and we were in God's Green Valley. It was by Warm Springs Creek, and it ran into the Salmon River. And there were so many salmon that my father, when he'd come up from being in the law office, he'd be in his suit, and all he'd do is take off his top coat. He'd get into waders, and he'd go fishing on a fly rod for salmon. And you could just see them down at the end of the meadow, our lower meadow. We had an upper meadow and a lower meadow. And at the end of that meadow was where the Salmon River made the bend around to meet Warm Springs Creek. And as it made the bend around, the salmon would just be thick there. And Pop would catch him on a fly rod. And he liked diamonds, and it was the boom day in Mackay, and he got diamonds from Mom, and he had a diamond stick pin, and my mother, while he was fishing and chasing this salmon up and down so he didn't break his fly rod, my mother suddenly saw his tie floating down the river, so she grabbed it, and it had the stick pin in it, so she had it made into a ring for him.
Oh, great.
And later, Frank had it, and later we gave it to Chase when he was born.
Wonderful. Well, so you had livestock there too?
Actually, not much. We had, it was strange how it became a dude ranch. It was a stage station, and then the stage station, when they homesteaded it, quit.
Okay,
And so then all they had was a few chickens, and they had some horses. But my mother finally said, we're going broke feeding people who drive up to here and say, we can't go on up the road. It's too dark and too late, and we can't find our way. And she said, we're going to go broke putting them all up and feeding them. So it became a dude ranch, and she ran it. And
I see.
That was when I was little, and it had already become a dude ranch.
Oh, okay.
And Mom was running it.
Bethine, you mentioned that you had an older brother that didn't survive. Did you have any other brothers and sisters?
No, I was an only child.
Oh.
And I just came along by accident because they'd been told by a doctor that they couldn't have any more children. Mom had been terribly ill with trouble with her kidneys and everything else, and had almost died. And my Pop took her out of Mackay on a special train to California, and that was about the time that he spent all the money that year in California getting her well. And when he got back to Arco, he went in to see the banker there, and the banker said, Chase, there are some cars down on the railroad track, if you take one of them and drive back into Mackay as though you've got money, you'll probably do fine. And so he gave him money enough to do it. Hello? Uh-huh.
Okay, we're recording again.
Okay, where were we?
We were talking about the car that your father picked up in...
Oh, yes, and went back to Mackay, and then he managed to have a really fine law practice until the Depression closed the banks. It closed the bank in Mackay, and he was one of the directors. And he said the little old people that had money there would not be able to get any of it back, and nor to make enough of it. So he sold everything he had in Stanley Basin. He had a lot of property in Stanley Basin.
Oh, really?
With a friend from Salt Lake. And they sold all the cattle they were running on it. And he put the money back into the bank so that people could have the money that they had lost.
So the property he sold wasn't Robinson Bar property, it was property down in Stanley Basin.
The only thing he kept was the ranch.
Oh.
He sold all of Stanley Basin and all of the cattle.
Oh.
Everything else he had.
So he and his partner had been running cattle there in the basin.
A lot of them.
Oh. Do you remember who his partner was?
Yes, his name was McCarthy. And Judge McCarthy was with the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad and had lots of money. And Pop made a deal with him that they could sell off part of the cattle and be able to keep the basin. And Judge McCarthy wouldn't, so they just sold the whole thing. And Pop took his half and helped bail people out. And then we moved over to Idaho Falls because my grandmother was there.
Oh, okay, so you moved. Now, when you were, before you moved to Idaho Falls, then, did you go to grade school in Mackay?
Yes, up till the 3rd grade.
Oh.
And then when we went over to Idaho Falls, I went to school there for 17 years. That is, until I was 17, I was in high school when we left for Pop to become governor.
What was grade school like in Mackay? There probably weren't very many kids, were there?
Oh, it was pretty full because
really?
Everybody from all around the area came in to Mackay to go to school. And I had a terrible experience there because there was a slide that you went down, and at the bottom there was a big mud puddle. And it was recess, and I made someone promise to catch me when I got down there, and they didn't, and I landed in the puddle. And I was madder than a wet hen, so I went to my aunt's, who was down about a few blocks away, and just left school for the afternoon. I was so furious. Then my aunt called my mother.
Oh, no.
But the ranch was wonderful, and we had the ranch after my mother didn't run it anymore when she was the governor's wife. My Aunt Beulah, who was my mother's half-sister and had been raised from the time she was about 7 or 14, I don't remember quite. She'd been raised by Pop and Mom, so she always seemed like she was my big sister, and she was 20 years older than I was. And when Frank said, as a senator, that he thought it would be improper for him to have an inholding in an area he was trying to make a part of the Sawtooth recreation area, because it was right on the edge of it. And it could be put under easement. And he said it would be a terrible thing for that 123 acres to be developed. And as he felt the same way about the whole Stanley Basin. I remember when we drove over Galena one time, stopped on the viaduct, we saw, down below we saw them cutting roads and putting up telephone poles and making a very big mess in the valley. And that's when Frank decided that they had to make an SNRA. And he was such a purist about taking any money. He said, there are people who get rich at the federal trough, but I'm not going to be one of them. And so we sold it for $140,000, and we split it with Beulah and myself. And everybody said afterward, including Arnold Hanson, who helped make the SNRA, that was really a silly thing for Frank to do. Your children and grandchildren could have loved it.
Oh, and they would have.
Yeah, they would have. But Frank thought that was important. And of course, Carole King put it up for $19 million. And I thought it was pretty bad because she never would put it under easement. So if anything happened to it, it could be developed.
Now, when your family, you and Frank sold it, did you sell it to her, or was there intermediaries?
No, we sold it to a consortium here in Boise that had my cousin in it and several other people.
Okay.
But it didn't work out, and then they sold it to LaFavor, who had a restaurant there for a while. And then he and his wife broke up, and eventually it ended up in Carole King's hands. And she always said she was a great environmentalist, but I always wondered because not putting that under easement,
That's odd.
so it could be badly developed,
Yeah.
didn't seem great to me.
Yeah. Well, when your father became governor and you moved over to Boise, then your Aunt Beulah, she continued to operate it as a dude ranch?
She ran it
Uh-huh.
for years after that.
Uh-huh.
And we'd go up there in the summer whenever Frank could get away and the kids. And she took, our sons were 9 years apart, but she'd take the two of them for the summer up there.
Oh.
So both Forrest and Chase had a chance to enjoy it,
Yeah.
but not any of my other grandchildren,
Yeah.
and so it was too bad.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, when you were a child there, were you a tomboy? Were you a real outdoors person?
Actually, I was always my father's confidant, and we talked politics, we talked law, we talked every case he was in. It was wonderful, and at the same time I was his princess because I was the only girl.
Yeah.
So I can remember once he brought me a riding outfit that looked like the one that Jacqueline Kennedy used to ride in, and it was so out of place on our ranch. It was sort of a green twill, I remember, and you know how those were made, those Eastern riding outfits.
Right.
Well, my mother said she never objected to anything Pop bought for either of us, but she said, this one may have been a mistake. I think if she wears it very much, they'll laugh her out of the company.
Probably so.
And we had a guy there who lived in a little cabin across Warm Springs Creek, and he always thought he got along fine with a great big bull we had. And I remember one of the most terrifying times I ever had was he was going to show everybody how he and the bull got along, and he put his arm around the bull and didn't have the nose thing, didn't have hold of it.
Yeah.
He just had his arm around the shoulders of the bull, and the bull went up and down, dragging him with him, and Pop rushed out from the ranch and said, Bethine, stand behind the poles that were around the place we used to hang clothes, and don't come out. And then he went up with a teeny little stick and made that bull march off and got the guy free. He had pretty banged up ribs, but he he lived. And it was just because Pop took that little stick and went after the bull. It was really something.
Oh.
But when Frank was senator and had done the SNRA with McClure and Hanson and of course C. Sanders and all of the people who were involved in making the SNRA, after that, for a long time we didn't have anything in that area. And then he decided he wanted to do the river return, no return, wilderness. And I went to every one of his hearings with him. And he had hearings in every part of the state. Near Stanley, in fact in Chalice, all up in the north, because the river of no return wilderness reaches up over a huge portion of that part of Idaho.
Yes.
So we had hearings everywhere. But a hearing I remember most was the hearing in Chalice, or Salmon. It was in Salmon. And they had a sort of a building that was just made out of wood and had wood steps and an aisle, and they set up chairs, and the people from the Senate were there at the end to hold a hearing on whether they should make it into a wilderness. Mm-hmm. And this man got a horse and rode it up the wooden steps and down the aisle and turned around and rode back out. And it turned out the man who was running the newspaper there in Salmon said, "Well, Mrs. Church, what did you think of that?" I said, "It's a mighty fine-looking horse." And Frank said, "I'm glad he asked you that."
Well, were the people in Salmon, were they opposed to
Oh,
wilderness?
yes, deeply.
Deeply?
Deeply. And in Stanley, Stanley was so adamant about the SNRA that they just were awful. And in fact, one of the worst of them was a cousin that I had who had a little motel that was down in Lower Stanley. But that was the year Frank ran against Steve Sims' old assistant, who was Smith. And they were adamant that Frank was going to ruin the whole area. It was going to take away their livelihood, that he was going to get rich at it, all 140,000 that we split.
And that was mostly about the SNRA?
Yeah, that was the reason. Yeah, because it was right there in it. But when we did the River of No Return, it had a connection. He also did wild and scenic rivers for the whole United States, and that included the Salmon and that Middle Fork area. And when Frank was dying at home for 3 months of the second cancer he'd had in his life, he'd had a bad cancer 36 years before, when our son Forrest was born. And they said he was going to die then. So he always said he had 36 years to do what he wanted to do. So he was never going to put his finger up in the wind and say, "Will this get me reelected, or is it the right thing to do?"
So he was able to do what he wanted to do.
He did. From then on, after surviving that first cancer, he said, "I've been given a lease on life, so I can do what I think I should do." And so he thoroughly enjoyed being senator. I think up until the last year or so, when everything got so contentious in Washington. Because before that, he worked with both sides of the aisle. He worked with Len Jordan, who is from here, who was a Republican. He worked with Jack Javits from New York. He worked with Aiken. He worked with a senator from Kentucky, John Sherman Cooper, and with a senator from New Jersey, Hanson. I mean, Case. He just worked with everybody across the aisle. And after that, Jesse Helms was in the Senate, and everything became a bone of contention. And I think it's gone that way ever since '80.
Tell me about when and where you met Frank.
I actually met him, I was in student government in Idaho Falls. He was in student government in Boise, and we had a student government association meeting in Boise. And my best friend, who was the student body president, Donna Piper, who's now still in Idaho Falls. She's out at Ammon. She and I went over for this. I was the Supreme Court judge, and she was the student body president. We went over, and she went out with the student body president over there. I met Frank. He asked me out, but a young man who was a basketball player asked me first, so I said, I'm sorry. But Frank wasn't deterred at all. He said, that's fine, we'll just go on being friends.
Now,
And
how old were you then?
About 16.
And you were living in Idaho Falls, and was he living in Boise?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
He was born and raised in Boise.
Okay.
Born at St. Alphonsus and was raised here. And he then, the year that I graduated, I was a year ahead of him, he became the student body president in Boise. And I went on to Boise Junior College.
Did you finish high school in Boise then?
Boise and Idaho Falls. I got 2 diplomas, and I've been looking for them ever since. I had them both in hand. Our superintendent of schools said that I was so involved in both schools. I was only here a half a year, but I got so involved with Boise that I graduated there. But then he let me graduate with my class in Idaho Falls too.
Oh, great. That doesn't happen very often.
Not very often.
So, so you stayed in touch with Frank after that first meeting for you?
Well, actually, we went together while he was the student body president and I was out at Boise State. We went together to the dances at high school at Boise High. We went out together, and his 4 friends, Stan Burns, who just died, who helped make the green belt here and was a really good outdoorsman, and who ended up in the Boulder White Clouds with Frank. He and Carl Burke, who's a lawyer, and Wade Fleetwood, and as I say, Stan Burns. They always used to come over on Sunday night, ostensibly to talk to Pop, who was governor, because they were all interested in politics, and talk to me. And Stan Burns said for years afterward that during those 2 years, he hadn't realized I was a girl. But everybody called me Frank's girlfriend, but we never made that anything, but I would go to dances with him, and he was in the ROTC. And so we'd go to the ROTC dances and all of them.
Now, did Frank, was he familiar with the Sawtooths and the White Clouds before he hooked up with you, or did you kind of introduce him?
No, I introduced him to that and because I took him to the ranch. And Pop would take he and Carl Burke out to show them the mine on the other side of the river, way up the mountain. And they'd go up Warm Springs Creek to the 12-mile meadow, and we'd all camp out. And so that was, but when he was a kid here in Boise, he used to go up to Warm Lake with his parents up near, out of Mackay, Worm Lake area.
I do.
And he'd go up there with them, and they'd go fishing and hiking and all around. And that's where he wrote me, the first thing he wrote me, and he wrote me over the years, he wrote a postcard. And he wrote it, as he would often do, Dearest Bethy. And then he gave me a story about a German who had it was near the time that there were big doings in Germany, and the Germans thought they didn't have enough humor. So he said there was this desk that this military German had, and it had a big hole in it, and it was from a bomb, of course. He said it was a mouse hole, ha ha. And then at the bottom he said, and today I am 17.
Ah. Did you keep that? You still have that
Oh, yeah.
card?
I have, and then I have all the letters he wrote me from the India-Burma China Theater when he was over there in the war.
Mm-hmm.
He became an intelligence officer.
Now, he was in World War II. Was that before? That was before you were married, wasn't it?
Yes. And he came back, and he hadn't finished college. So he finished college. Then we were married, and we went on a 2-month honeymoon, or 3 months almost, down to Mexico. And my pop had given us a blue convertible, and so we drove all the way down to New Orleans and down to Mexico City, down the north-south highway, and all down into Acapulco and Tasco and everywhere. Came back, and we went out almost immediately, packed the car, and left for Boston. He went to Harvard for a year, and he got on the...
And he was still in undergraduate school then?
no, he was going back. He finished just before we were married.
Okay.
He finished the week before we were married.
Did he go to Stanford?
Well, he went to Stanford, but then he went to Harvard for a year, and then he was having horrible back pains, and we were about to have Forrest. So I said, we can't do this winter in Boston again. Let's go back to Stanford. So he transferred back to Stanford to get his law degree. And if he hadn't, he probably would have died, because he had this terrible cancer. His backache wasn't just from studying. It was a testicular cancer, and they told him that he was not going to live. But he went to Stanford to a fine doctor in the city who said, oh yes, we'll put you on, we've got a new deep radiation. So they really burned him up for about 6 weeks, from here down to here. And I think that's what probably caused his pancreatic cancer 36 years later. But it gave him 36 years.
Yeah.
So he was fine.
Yeah. Now, where were you married?
On the front porch of the ranch.
I thought so.
Yeah. And it just snowed madly over Galena 2 days before we were married, on the 21st of June. And it snowed 2 days before. And all of our friends had to go up over Galena, which wasn't fixed then.
Right. It was still a gravel road.
It was
then.
awful, and it was twisty.
Yeah.
You know, just like that. And just a minute, honey, we're doing a filming. And that's Chase who came in. But he's used to it. He's always doing a filming. And he also was taking some death certificates up to our family that Stan Burns, who died. But I remember most of my family, and most of his family, didn't know each other.
And they had to access, at that point they were accessing the ranch over Galena.
Over Galena. And it was horrible. And it was a big snowstorm. And the lady who was bringing the cake up, sitting in the back of the car, Dr. Norse was driving the car, and his wife was a very formidable woman. And she said to him, Doctor, you should get on the side of the road. He said, I'm going to drive right down the middle or we'll slide off in the canyon. And so they got there with the cake. The night before, we had salmon, which my cousin had caught, and everybody who was at the ranch had caught salmon. And my grandfather, who was alive then, great big Western man, cut up all the salmon for salmon dinner the night before the wedding.
Was it a big wedding?
It was pretty big, about, I don't know. I remember we had every room in the lodge filled, every room in the outer cabins filled, and the boys and girls who came with their friends had a excuse me.
Okay.
They had a tent out back, and my dad greeted everybody. He invited everybody to come and stay at the ranch.
Now the ranch was still a dude ranch then.
Uh-huh, but it was fall, spring, and it hadn't opened yet. You know, we never opened till almost the 4th of July.
Right.
And it always ended up by Labor Day. So it wasn't a very lucrative thing. It just barely made it. In fact, I think during the Depression, when my mom ran it, was the only time it ever ran on what she made. It always had to throw extra money into it. But Pop had an envelope that was made out of a paper bag, and he put where everybody was going to sleep. And you remember Spencer Tracy having the bad dreams the night before his daughter's wedding? Well, Pop had a bad dream that he had put all the husbands and wives in with each other, not in the right places, and all the kids together that he shouldn't have. And he had a terrible dream. My mother had to wake him up.
Oh.
And we went from there to the night of the wedding. We Stan Burns put rocks in our hubcaps, but that wasn't the worst thing he did. That was, we had this new DeSoto, and it had these two heads on it, and he moved the spark plugs. So we had only about one spark plug or two power.
Now, was this the car that your father had bought you
Yeah.
to drive to Mexico? This was a convertible.
Uh-huh.
And it was a DeSoto?
Uh-huh. And we left the ranch, and the hubcaps sounded terrible. And Frank said, "Don't worry, Bethine, I'll fix it. I'll take the rocks out of the hubcaps." I said, "There's something else wrong." So I opened the front of the car, looked in, and saw that they'd switched all these things. So I switched them back, and we pulled out. And I always said that was the thing that I really had always known about Frank. He was so secure, he didn't even mind my savings.
Boy, you must have been pretty mechanical.
Well, I had
cars were a little simpler then, maybe.
Well, they were. And besides, they were fixable by hand. And we, I remember I had looked at it down here because a cousin of mine was so excited about it. And I looked in, and I knew it looked different.
Uh-huh.
When I saw all those wires going other ways, I knew it wasn't right. So I just switched them back. And we went to, I think we went down to Salmon and stayed all night and in a motel, and two of my father and mother's friends from Idaho Falls ended up in the same motel, and we had cleaned up our car from all the rocks and all that stuff. They just plastered it with white shoe polish.
Oh.
Yeah, but just married. And then we started out, and I always thought I knew that area well, and I said, let's take a shortcut going to, because we were late after we had to clean up the car. So I said, let's take a shortcut on our way to Yellowstone Park. That's where we were to stay that second night. And we got stuck. And a man in a truck came by and said, looks like you guys are having some trouble. And he pulled us out. I think those are the days that everybody was so, he laughed at us, but he got a kick out of it and pulled us out.
But he saved you.
Yeah.
Got you back on the road.
Yeah. So then we went on and had this long honeymoon, and then went back east to Harvard, then back to Stanford, and survived the first cancer, and then he died of the second one 36 years later, and he'd had 24 years in the Senate. So he said he'd had a good run for it.
Yeah, yeah. You were talking a short while ago about people having to go over Galena to get to Robinson Bar to your wedding. Do you remember the first time you went over Galena?
Yes, but it was a Thanksgiving, and I was learning to drive. I think I was about 14, and we drove out of Ketchum and up over Galena, and as we started up, I lost traction, and my pop said, well, there's no way we're going to go on down now. And he got out, and I got out, and he got back in and backed up to where we could get a little traction to make it back down the hill.
Wow.
So we didn't get to the ranch that time.
Oh.
And one other time we were going with my Uncle Brazil. We were going up the road that I reminded you was on the other side of the river, and it had 5 points,
Right.
and we almost slipped off of one of them. And Uncle Brazil and Pop were holding the car on. My mother was driving, and they managed to keep it from sliding off the hill. And so everybody walked in, and they sent a horse and a sleigh back and picked up everything. And then we had our Thanksgiving dinner there.
Oh.
And I went in the hot water pool that one time in the winter when it was 45 below zero up there.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you if you spent, I know it was, for the Dude Ranch it was a summer facility, but did you guys spend some winter time up there?
Well, we had spent the winter time when I was a baby.
You were a baby.
And when I was really very young. In fact,
was that because of the homesteading?
Well, no, it was because they thought there was a lot of whooping cough. And they thought they ought to get me away from it.
Oh.
And a little girl came through one night, and they said they needed to stay. And my mom let them. And when she heard him cough, she knew we were in trouble. And I got whooping cough, and that was the second time in their lives they had to take the family down to California to get over something.
Oh, wow.
My mother had, and then I came down with a whooping cough. And I was so sick.
So you went all the way to California?
Yeah. Because we had to get the warm air.
Oh. Well, normally, did you just kind of shut the ranch up for the winter?
Yes. Usually we had the caretaker there.
Uh-huh.
Somebody who, usually we were paying caretakers, they wanted to stay in, and they'd stay there just to have room and board. And
Do you remember any of those people?
oh, I don't really not. I could tell you some of them, I guess. I think my cousin Lois, who is now on the Sawtooth Society board, could tell you more about some of the people who were there at the ranch. And she helped run it one year.
And this is, what is Lois's last name?
Oh, no, I'm sorry, it's her mother, his name is Lois, it's Patricia Young.
Patricia Young.
Mhm.
Okay.
And she ran it one summer too.
Oh,
So it was pretty much of an enterprise.
yeah,
And we had
yeah,
to keep it going.
yeah. What were the, well, I know you weren't there much, but were the winters pretty extreme?
Oh yeah, in those days there were just tons of snow. And in Idaho Falls, my police dog loved to chase cars, and we had drifts that had been plowed out that were way up above the street that high, and he was chasing cars on it, and he ended up slipping off and ending up on the top of a truck. That was how high the piles of snow were.
Did he survive that?
Yep, he got off at the other end.
Uh-huh.
But I don't think he chased cars after that.
Maybe not. Maybe that was a good thing. What, after Frank got into politics and you were, was in the Senate, did you get back to the ranch much?
Well, there were several years that the kids stayed there with Beulah, and we would go for a week or so.
Mm-hmm.
And then there were years after that that we would just go visit it. Like when the LaFavors had it, we were there one year as guests and eating out and enjoying it.
Mm-hmm.
But after Frank was in the Senate, it got very hard to do.
Yeah.
And finally, we got to the point where our vacations, we'd come out here and campaign in the summer, but our vacations were really usually at Easter time. We'd go down fishing in the Caribbean or something. It was just too hard on Frank to go to the mountains because they were always mad at him over wilderness.
Well, in the early years, were you and he able to spend quite a bit of time there?
Not really. Sometimes I spent quite a bit of time in high school, but not really. Chase is putting up a ladder. He's going to clean out our gutters.
Did you, well, when you were there, what did you do? Did you do a lot of fishing? Did you ride? Did you...
Well, they always said that it wasn't any fun fishing with me because I usually went swimming, and it scared the fish. I loved getting in the water in the Warm Springs Creek. And as a kid, we just swam all the time for hours a day.
Did you have cousins that were there with you?
Yeah. I had one cousin, Dale Patterson, whose son Scott just called me a few minutes ago. He lived with us because his father died during the First World War of the flu epidemic that was a lot like this HIV flu or whatever it is.
Swine flu.
Yeah. He died of it. He was a doctor. And so my Aunt Mabel and Dale came and lived with us. In Mackay, while he was in the war, she was Pop's secretary. But later on, even when we lived in Idaho Falls and here in Boise, they often lived with us. And after he was married, she lived with Pop and Mom too.
Mm-hmm. So even though you didn't have siblings, you'd had
we had
lots of kids.
Yeah, and one of the reasons I came home to Idaho, besides the fact that I really wanted to do something other than what I was doing out there, after Frank died, I stayed for about 4 years and worked with the Democratic National Committee. And that was loads of fun, and I helped handle the foreign visitors to the Georgia Convention, and that was fun.
Yeah.
But I really wanted to come home, but I didn't have any idea what I was going to do or where I was going to live. And when I found this house, I immediately fell in love with it, and I put a contingency on buying this with my selling the house that we had in Bethesda, which we paid on for 20 years, and it was paid off. And we were very lucky. We sold just before the crash in Washington and bought just before everything went way up here. Mm-hmm. So that helped.
Frank passed away in 84.
84. And I came back in 89.
I was going to ask you a little more about the SNRA. I know Frank was, very instrumental in that, along with a few other people, but...
Actually, it was his idea.
Mm-hmm. And that sprang from...
From just my pop saying that was the most wonderful valley in the world, and our having been over there when it was pristine and beautiful, and he saw all the building in Sun Valley and all those places, and he just thought if they could protect that area and make it like a ranch area, so that it looked like it had looked back in Pop's day, it would be worthwhile.
And you were starting to see a lot of development.
Well, what happened was we first saw they were going to build a new little city down there, and they put roads and everything. And that's when he decided to do the SNRA.
Was that Obsidian?
Uh-huh. And then, when I came home and was here, I saw this article in the Sawtooth, in the paper here, that they were planning all sorts of building up in the Sawtooth, and there's someone who was thinking of making a major development again. And so that's when I called everybody to make the Sawtooth Society. And it was fine. I called Republicans, I called Democrats, I called former county commissioner from Chalice, who was a Republican. I called Bob Hayes here, who had just retired from Boise Cascade, and he said he would be my executive director for free for about 9 months or so, or even more. And I accepted because what I had done was get in over my head, because I had no idea how you set up a 501c3, but we had to do it right away.
Yeah.
And we had a lot of help doing it. We managed to raise funds under the auspice of a national forest group, and then we made our appeal here, and people really cared so much. Idaho, they always have loved that area.
Yeah.
And I think it has stayed very viable, simply because we did work with the Forest Service. When we didn't agree with them, we told them so. But when we agreed, we backed them up heartily. So we really came out very well on it, I think.
Yeah, yeah. Do you remember who, I know there were, a lot of the local people that were opposed to the SNRA, but who were some of the political opponents? Do you remember?
Oh, most of the people who were in the legislature and such, in the Republican legislature, were against it.
The Idaho.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. What about nationally?
Well, nationally, they didn't know Idaho existed.
So they didn't know where the Sawtooths were anyway.
No. No, they really didn't. They didn't know where Idaho was.
Yeah.
Every time they'd say that Frank was a national figure, they'd say, "Where is he from?" And they'd say, "Idaho." "Where's that?" And there were people, when I went to University of Michigan for school, I graduated there. I was there 3 years and graduated there. I went to Boise Junior College first. But I'd say I was from Idaho, and they'd say, well, now is that near the Mississippi? Or is that near, what is it near?
Yeah.
They never knew. I said, I know where you are. Why don't you know where we are? Don't you know any geography? I get so mad.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I was going to ask you, you know, through the years, the Forest Service has been, you know, very instrumental in the Sawtooth Salmon River country because they manage such a big chunk
area.
of Forest Service.
And they haven't had enough money.
Yeah, I was.
And that's why I think it was important for us to be a private group who could help them with our senators so that we could get the land and water fund monies running again. After Frank went out in 80, they just decimated the land and water fund monies. They put it into everything else.
Now, and that money, I'm not familiar with that. That money
That
had
money,
historically been used.
yes, for the Forest Service and for the land improvement.
Oh.
But it stopped coming in. That's what put us, 90% of the easement was done with land, with that kind of monies.
Mm-hmm.
And when the U.S. found itself going broke, they went into those funds and took them to use for every other thing. So they weren't available to the Forest Service.
Mm-hmm.
So the Forest Service was cut down, though they had more people to cope with all the time. They were cut down from the amount of monies they had. And they really needed a advocacy group that was local that could help them. And we went national and we made appeals and it worked nationally too.
Yeah.
And people who run the river, like the Dave Mills and Sheila and people like that, became a good part of the Sawtooth Society and cared a lot about the river and how it was kept up. And you know, even though some of the things they did seemed sort of onerous, like having to take in something to take out your ashes and take out your waste, that's what kept it pristine.
Right, and you're talking about Middle Fork.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. In the wilderness.
It made all the difference.
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
And of course, the one reason they were able to get the SNRA is they let Stanley be itself. It's the
Stanley's pretty independent.
Very independent. And they thought the Sawtooth Society was just going to be a terrible thing. But I think they finally come around to thinking it's a pretty good idea.
Yeah, Sawtooth Society has funded a lot of local projects.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which was very smart to do.
Mm-hmm.
And help them with search and rescue things,
Oh yeah.
with monies for all sorts of things to help them go out and rescue people that were stranded. And I think they just done a great job.
Yeah, yeah. Were there any particular individuals in the Forest Service that you remember that were really instrumental or helpful, like in regard to the SNRA? Or?
Well, Tom Kovalicki was always wonderful. He ran the Nez Perce and cared very much about the SNRA, and he'd bring a whole group of people in to build those logworm fences.
He still does that.
And he does that, yeah.
Yeah.
I know, and he's living in Stanley during the summer.
Mm-hmm.
But that's where I just heard from him. And also Paul Reese and a radio man from Ketchum. When I first got the idea, and they had the idea, we met, all the three of us, met over in Ketchum and talked about what could be done, and if we could make a group like the Yellowstone group, what kind of a group, how we should be in terms of, and Paul Reese was a forester.
Right, and he's based out of Ketchum, isn't he? Or was?
He was. He and his wife both.
Mhm.
But he's now, I don't know, I heard from him just the other day. He's in the east somewhere. He's got a pretty big job with the Forest Service, and she does too. So they've done very well.
Right.
But we've stayed very good friends. He had the Wilderness Society. He told them all to be sure and tell me hello.
Yeah. What about Forest Service people back in the early 70s when Frank was working on creating the SNRA? Were there people in the Forest Service that were very involved with that as well?
Well, you know, I try to think back to the ones that I met in their office back there. And there were those who were rather big supporters and those who I think thought that putting more money into Twin Falls and into Idaho was a mistake.
Oh, really?
So, you know, you had people you were battling against. Then there was Jim Lyons, who was just a terrific supporter.
Mm-hmm. He's on the Sawtooth Society board now,
Yeah.
I believe.
Now he is.
Mm-hmm.
And then he was working with the Forest Service in Washington. He was I guess he was a department, can't remember, I think he was he had a big job with the Department of Agriculture back then.
I was going to ask you a few more things about Robinson Bar before I forget. Did you have, what was it, you know, when you were a child there, did you have, did you have indoor plumbing? Did you have power?
Well, we had they had a dam, and they put a municipal power, a power pump in the river.
Okay.
It was run by the dam.
Uh-huh.
It was a flume that carried
Oh.
the water down to it.
Okay, so that's how you got
Uh-huh.
water.
And once in a while, sticks would get caught in it, and all of our lights would go very dim, and everybody'd have to go out and clean the thing off so that the water could flow through again.
So you sort of had your own little power system there.
Yeah.
Oh.
And we had indoor plumbing, but we didn't have toilets. We had the toilets down by the river that were
Okay.
outdoor,
Okay.
right down the hill.
Yeah. And you obviously wouldn't have had phones back then.
Well, we had the old phone that you went like this.
The crank?
Uh-huh.
Oh.
And we were on a line that everybody was on,
Uh-huh.
and you'd hear them, and occasionally you'd have to say, "If you could get off, I'll be off in a few minutes." And I remember how many rings we had.
Oh. Now, did you have that do you remember that from the very early days when you were a child, having that phone system?
I just don't remember.
Mm.
But I remember most of my life we had it
Uh-huh.
on the river. And, you know, then the rural electrification came in
Yeah.
later on. And then we had our power that way.
Would that have been in the 50s or so?
Probably, I can't remember. When I wrote my book, Dan Williams used to say, "When was it?" And I'd say, "You'll have to look it up."
Yeah, I think Stanley got power in the early 50s.
I don't know when it came to the ranch.
Uh-huh. When you were at the ranch, did you ever go, you visit places like Custer and Bay Horse? Those old...
Oh, once in a while we go up to Custer because we thought the dredge boys came down and would date the girls that were working at the ranch.
Oh.
And then they'd go up to Stanley on Saturday night for the Stanley Stomp.
Did you do that?
Uh-huh.
Ah.
But I was too young to really be a big part of it. But I did it later on with Frank. And he said when we went to Poland one time, and the Polish, when we get to a place where they had a dance floor, all they could think of was that we were English because of how we dressed, and so they'd play the bridge over the River Kwai. And Frank would say, the only reason we could dance to this is we could dance to the Stanley Stomp.
So you and Frank went to the Stanley Stomp?
Yeah.
Was that kind of a wild time?
No, it was just fun.
Yeah?
And the Mahonies were up there then.
Mm-hmm.
And once when a cousin of mine's husband wanted to buy into the ranch to run it with Beulah, they'd have done it very well, but the cousin, the woman, was a little bit uppity, and she was in the watching them play cards one night, and of course Mahoney always played cards at the Ace of Diamonds.
Are you talking about Dan Mahoney?
Uh-huh. Dad Mahoney's father.
Dan Mahoney
Yeah.
Sr., yes.
And of course he was a big, owned a big newspaper down in Florida. And this uppity cousin said he asked her to dance with him. And she just turned him down flat. When she found out who she was, she tried to wiggle back, and he would have nothing of it.
Was that when he was a real young man?
Well, I think it was when he and his wife had that big acreage that Dan Mahoney Jr. had.
Mm-hmm. They spent a lot of time in
A
Stanley,
lot
didn't
of
they?
it, a lot of it.
Yeah.
And he was there almost every summer for a lot of summers.
Mm-hmm.
And she'd be there part of the summer.
Mm-hmm. Is her name Jean?
No. Her name was Florence Mahoney. She was a mover and doer in health with Mary Lasker in Washington,
Oh.
and knew all the senators and worked hard on health matters.
Oh. Did you, so when you were spending summers at the ranch, did you go into Stanley much?
Well, just on occasion.
Uh-huh.
But we also, when I was young, really young, we used to go on camp at Redfish.
Did ya?
Yeah. Here we were in a rustic setting of our own in our own beds, and we'd go camping at Redfish.
Oh, well, Redfish is so beautiful.
Yeah.
Still lovely.
Yeah, it still looks wonderful, and whoever has that facility seems to run it with loving care.
Yes.
So we're lucky.
Yes.
Well,
So
I
you-
think we ought to stop, don't you?
We can stop.
I'm getting a little hoarse.
Okay, we can stop anytime you're ready.
I think, I always had friends up there because families came to the ranch. All the families came with their children. And the whole McCarthy family had 5 or 6 children that would come at a time. And we'd all swim together, and we'd all play together all day long. And Mary McCarthy and I were the same age, and we would design big plays to be played down in we had a area down below that had was sort of like a big auditorium, but it was open, and it had some bedrooms at the back, and then sort of the open part of it, we would put on plays.
Oh. Were the McCarthy's guests at the ranch?
Uh-huh. And I always used to beg to go in and eat with them, so occasionally I would. And we had lots of families. I run into people, when I was out selling the book, I ran into people in Twin Falls, in Idaho Falls, all around, who said, we just hated it when the ranch was sold. Well, our wonderful summers up there with our family were so important to us. And there was always someone to play with. I mean, I never felt alone up there. And we had a rule that was like in the Samoan Islands, I found, when I studied the Samoan Islands and how the hierarchy was the adults. Well, at the ranch, there was one rule of thumb. If any adult at all, told you to do something, you were to do it. And so we never had a drowning in the river, we never had a drowning in the pool. We were very lucky because they had this rule of the thumb that it didn't matter, you didn't have to respond just to your parents. You had to respond to everybody. I guess we better let Chase come in.
Okay.
Okay,
Well,
dear.
thank you very much. It
Well,
was
thank
wonderful
you.
to talk with you.
You want to turn it off?
Yes, I will.